Hello and welcome to the Seatton Education Podcast, where we delve into all things home education with expert guests. I'm Victoria. I'm joined today by Gerald Huebner, Chair of the Global Home Education Exchange, to talk about homeschooling in different countries around the world. Gerald, thanks so much for joining me.
It is my pleasure to join you, and it's a privilege. Thank you.
Not at all, and I've probably given you far too short an introduction there. Could you just explain your experience with home education organizations around the world?
Well, first of all, I am a homeschool dad just like others. We come from a small town in the middle of Canada, and I remember the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation interviewing me and asking, how did you get to be involved in this global thing? Like, you're from the middle of Canada. And it's not something I ever planned on. The leadership started by working with other homeschool families in our province to deal with government issues and those kinds of things. I got involved nationally in Canada, and then there was an opportunity and a need to be able to work together with others from around the world, and we formed the Global Home Education Exchange and have had four world conferences now. So it's not something I ever planned for, but it's been a privilege and a pleasure.
And so why did you decide to get involved? Did you think it was something that you were just really interested in because of your own experiencing with your family homeschooling? Or was it something that you felt there were issues that needed to be addressed? Or what drove you into firstly getting involved on a national level in Canada?
Well, first of all, we come from a place where this thing, we call it home education or homeschooling. Some places call it family education, some places call it unschooling, but it has always been legal and lawful in the province of Manitoba where we live to do this. Right from the inception of Manitoba as a province in the year 1870, it was the right of parents to be able to follow another path, to do education at home. And it's something that I've always been convinced that from our experience with our family, it works and it works well. And I simply wanted other families across Canada and around the world to be able to have the ability to make that choice and experience that same joy as a family. I thought it was something that if I could work together with others, because it's really the partnership, be able to work together with others to be able to advance this thing, that was something I was interested in doing.
We met through GHEX, through the Global Home Education Exchange. Can you just explain to people who haven't heard of that, what's the mission of it as an organization?
Well, the mission of the Global Home Education Exchange is basically to advance the freedom of parents to be able to choose and direct the education of their children according to their beliefs and their values. And we're not specific to either motivation or methodology. So we have people from all backgrounds of faith and values and all methodologies. So there's many different methods that people will use, from classical to very unprogrammed, and they what works for one family doesn't necessarily work for one family. So there's no one best way, and we basically are there to be able to work together with people from around the world that want to advance this. And so we have countries where it's fully legal. We have province or places where it is technically illegal, but you can still do it. And we have places where it's virtually impossible because of the what I would call the persecution and the prosecution that governments put in place and the roadblocks that they put in place. So advancing and really clearing the roadway for parents to be able to do this.
And I mean, you've spoken in countries where it is illegal, and you've held events in countries where it's illegal. And I'm interested to know, what was your experience going to those countries and, holding these events about home education?
Well, our first global conference was actually in a country where it is virtually illegal. It's not far from you. It's Germany. In Germany, some parents are able to undertake this, but only in very limited circumstances, and it is very controlled. We went there to try to influence things and make a difference. It's still illegal. We haven't been able to crack the nut yet, but still working on it. There's other countries like Sweden that are even more vigorous in their persecution and their prosecution. But we're seeing progress around the world. We're seeing that various agencies that would have never acknowledged the existence of this alternative are now not necessarily promoting it, but they're acknowledging that parents are doing this. And that simple acknowledgement, that simple
Mm.
change of viewpoint, largely has come from COVID, but I think it was built on a foundation of many people successfully doing it. And then the viewpoint of many around the world has come to the place of doing something different, is now recognized as being something that should be possible, even in places where it is virtually impossible.
And what is it that you think concerns governments and legislators about home education? Why is it illegal in some places? What do you think is driving that?
I think that there's several things that drive it. It's fundamentally at one point it is an anti-establishment movement. The educational system in most places is set up by governments, by states, and has objectives to raise what they consider to be good citizens. And the definition of good citizens is not necessarily always consistent with what parents feel is the most important things. And I think it's seen as anti-establishment. So I think that it's seen as a threat. I think it's seen as a threat to the educational establishment. Educational institutions are funded in a variety of ways, but generally there are tax dollars of some kind that are collected from people in every country that are then given to school authorities. And generally, at least in many countries, when children are not in the school, the school doesn't receive the same level of grant. So in our country, there's somewhere in the range of $10,000 per student that does not flow to a school if the children are being homeschooled. Uh, and it doesn't take very many of those to add up to a teacher's wages, which in some communities will be seen as undermining the public education system. So some of it is a battle for
Mm.
ideology, some of it is a battle for money. And I think that somewhat of it is a battle for the minds of our children, because I think that there's a fear in some countries that we will be teaching our children things that are not necessarily what the mainstream of the public state education system is teaching. And I think we're guilty as charged in many cases, and because that's in part, at least, the reason why many parents are doing what they're doing is to do something different, to raise children that are not peer dependent, to raise children that function well and can communicate well and can have logical uh, analysis of policies and programs and all of these things. And although I think many schools will say that they're trying to do that, I don't think a lot of schools around the world are doing a great job of that. And that's I think why there's a disagreement. And I think
Mm.
fundamentally it's a disagreement on who is the one that is responsible for children. Is it parents or is it the state?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting question, and it would be interesting to see some longitudinal studies on, you know, does it impact states if they are not if children are not being fed through a state piece of machinery.
Mhm.
The data that we've looked at suggests that actually home-educated children often have a really high participation in civil society. Is that as graduates? Is that something you've seen to be true?
Well, I've seen it over and over, both in the reality of youth, as well as in the research studies that have looked at what happens to home educated students. And it, the fundamental number one always, or anywhere around the world, the question is, what about socialization? And that question is, I think, built on a foundation of people's viewpoints saying, if you home educate, you are taking children out of the real world and placing them in some artificial protected environment. I believe that the reality of the evidence, the research would say the real world is not the schools where children are in an environment of plus or minus 6 months of each other. They don't interact with parents, with older adults, and I think that the research basically says that if we want to raise children that are peer dependent, if we want to raise children that are more concerned about what their friends think than what is right and true, if we want to raise children that are not leaders and will not be willing to stand up, then probably home education is not the thing for you. I think my answer to what about socialization is what's your goal? What's your goal in socialization and what do you want to accomplish? And that will then determine what your choice is. And it's a deeper question. But I think it's
Mm.
one that goes to the heart of why parents want to be able to have the right and exercise that right to be able to choose and direct the education of their children.
And that's interesting when you say it's about choice. Obviously, I think that's a really important point to make, because some people will say, it's never going to be for me. That doesn't fit my lifestyle. It doesn't fit my values. I really want my children to go to a public, we say state school. And of course, fine, that provision exists. I suppose what you're trying to do is make this lesser known option more visible to people, so that this is also an option. What's the sort of biggest misconception maybe about home educating?
I think the biggest misconception is that it is somehow creating and raising children in an environment that is both unnatural and, in the opinion of some people, dangerous. I'll quote a friend who is one of the authors of a number of international conventions on education legally. For example, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, that would basically say that parents do have a right to choose and direct the education of their children, but states would say that they have a right to step in and control that. And this fellow, who is an author, would say that author of these documents would say that it's only if the parents are completely unable to exercise their right should the state have any role. So the parents should be in charge, and I think that the biggest downfall of education around the world, be it state or private, is where parents are not involved, where they're pushed to the side and not given the opportunity to be involved in the education of their children. Because the educators generally seem, I don't think they do it on purpose, but I think they're professionals. They know better, and they're trying to help, and they'll do it for the parents. And I think that it's a downfall. And I think home education is simply taking it to the limit of saying, we will do this completely. We'll take responsibility and we'll do it. And I fundamentally, my view is that education is a parental responsibility. Whether it's state school, whether it's a private school, or whether it's a homeschool, parents should be the ones that are responsible. And it's when parents do not exercise that right that there's challenges. And I simply want to encourage parents to be involved in the education
Mm.
of their children, whichever choice they make as being the best place and the best format, but be involved. And
Mm.
I think that home educating parents are simply wanting to be able to be free to be able to do that in the way that they see best for their children. And it works well.
I think the centrality of this idea of who is responsible for a child's education, the state or the parents, is so key to any discussion about educational choices more broadly. But I also think that it's a good point to make, because a lot of people whose children are in traditional school, whether that's private or state government funded schools, are they still believe that it should be parents who have this role. That's not just an idea held by homeschooling families. And actually, they're finding it obviously much more difficult to try and have that oversight into their child's education when they are not in control of their child's education.
Exactly. And that I think is the conundrum. That's the crux of the issue. And I think that's the point at which parents can be in partnership working together, whatever their educational choice,
Mm.
um, rather than being conflicted or feeling somehow that their choice is being judged by others. It's acknowledging and recognizing that, yeah, you made a choice. It's not the one I would make for my children, but you're the parent, not me. And I
Mm.
think being able to give each other the ability to make that decision and support each other in it as friends,
Mm.
I think is really important.
Because home educating is still, you know, very much not the mainstream choice. Immediately when you say that's the route that you've taken, people see it, I think, sometimes as an affront to the choice that they've made, in a way that I certainly don't feel the other way. I don't feel upset when someone says they're sending their child to a school, and I think that often it can be actually quite a big hurdle for people to enter into homeschooling, because they immediately, all their social references are saying that, well, we'll jump in and tell you all the reasons why that would be a terrible idea in the way that you would never probably have the guts to say in reply. Has that been something you've seen?
Oh, very much so. And I've had a change in my attitude and my viewpoint. I used to think that people started to home educate. They evaluate the options, they talk to people, they do different things and go to seminars, and then they'd start. I think that it's actually what generally happens is people stop. We all,
Mm.
I understand that there's a few people somewhere in the world that have people that will teach their children to walk and talk and potty train them and do all those things. Very rich people, but most of us, we we fumble our way through teaching our children all of these things, and we do it. We didn't go to school and have courses to learn how to do it. But then when our child turns this magical age of 5 or 6, we're all of a sudden told by society that we're no longer qualified. We're no
Mm.
longer qualified as parents to continue that journey. And I think that home education is simply continuing that journey. It's simply
Mm.
continuing to teach our children what they need to know in life. And I think that I think my message is that there's an opportunity to simply keep on doing what you're doing,
Mm.
and it's a you don't start, you just keep on going.
And I think that's such a great point, because actually those early skills, when a child has zero um, knowledge, zero base of knowing how to walk, for example, there's no reference points for a toddler when they're doing that. That's so much harder to teach. You know, it's cumulative. Once your child knows how to read, then teaching the next thing is a lot easier because they can read a book on it. Or, once they know how to read a book, well, they can read 2 books, and then they know how to have a debate, so then they can analyze those 2 books. And I think it's sad in a way, because I know people who have really struggled with the potty training, or really and say, oh, there's no way I could ever teach algebra. But you sort of say, well, actually your kids are going away at the point when it might start to get easier.
Exactly. You are enough. You can
Mm.
do this if you dedicate yourself to it, because it takes you basically being committed to learning as well. And it's not just following a book, it's building your life and your family and your home around this form of education. And I think it's a blast. It's a lot of fun. It's got its days, but it's more than worth it.
Now, that's a really good point, though, because a lot of lives, mainstream households, are not set up for home educating to happen. Both parents are going out to work. There's a lot of commute time. It looks so different from that. And I think sometimes that can be one of the reasons why people do feel, let's say, threatened by home education, because it does require a fundamentally different shift that I think sometimes in conversations and articles I've read can be perceived as anti-rights. So anti, for example, women's rights. It must be anti-women's rights because one person is likely going to have to stay at home. Often that is the mother. How do you approach that? How have you seen other countries approach that? Is it something that is a barrier, this sort of perception of what life should look like?
Well, I think that our society all around us is pushing us to be able to have the stuff, the things, the places, the uh, and we drive ourselves to have two jobs, to be able to accomplish this vision, versus us saying, what's the most important thing that we could do in the next 20 years? And I think the most important thing that parents can do is invest in growing and teaching and helping their children. And someday, I don't think that they will ever regret, I wish we'd worked harder and made more money. But I think that they will say, I'm really glad that we were able to spend time with our kids.
What do you think are the biggest challenges facing home educators in different parts of the world? I suppose there are some specific challenges. You've spent a lot of time in Ukraine, but also more broadly, what are challenges that you see maybe in commonality around the world that are facing home educators currently?
Well, I think that the biggest challenges are governments. One of the three lies in life is I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. And it's something we smile and we joke about, but government wants to regulate. That's what they know how to do. They don't. It doesn't matter that there's nothing that actually needs regulating. If you look at the research, if you look at places that are very high in the regulatory regime of home education and places that are very, very low, and look at the differences in the educational outcomes of children in those countries, you will see no correlation. So government regulation doesn't
Mm.
result in better learning or better marks in the part of the children. They probably result in more jobs within government, but it doesn't produce a better student. And yet government is driven by that. And the biggest challenge we have, I think, is having government simply stay out of our homes and allow us to do the things that we're doing. In most places in the world, home educators are paying the bills. They pay all of their own educational bills and are taking on the responsibility of doing it. They're saving government millions and millions and millions of pounds or dollars or whatever the currency is in the country, and they're taking that responsibility. But I don't think that that's always recognized by government, because government is driven by, well, we need to regulate this thing to make sure that children are not being abused or mistreated or uneducated or whatever policy objective they're working on that day. But they don't have measures that will say that is a problem. They may have an anecdotal article of some obscure person that had a problem. Whether they were actually being home educated is beside the facts. But that's the biggest challenge is those things.
Mm.
It's a lack of understanding and lack of perception on what is the issue. Once we can talk about it and work our way through it, generally we find that we can come up with a regulatory regime that's not always ideal from our perspective, but it'll be reasonable, and we can have some testing or some reporting or some things that are going on to meet the requirements of regulations in a way that's not obtrusive and not something that requires us to totally modify what we're doing. Because where you run into trouble is where you have to teach to the test when the test
Mm.
doesn't necessarily reflect what the child needs or should be learning. So those are some of the issues that are dealt with. There's exciting things happening around the world. For example, in Ukraine, homeschooling is booming. In a country, I would call it war schooling. It's almost like COVID schooling, where
Mm.
parents are tired of the online learning, they're tired of the bomb shelters, they're tired of the disruption. So they're just saying we'll keep our kids home and do this ourselves, including the minister of education for the country of Ukraine, whose son is being home educated. And there's a huge interest, and I find it really exciting when parents are taking responsibility even during these tough times, and I think are growing in ways that go beyond the books. And we see that happening in a variety of places.
Mm.
You get a place, for example, like United Arab Emirates, where the state schools are only for Emiratis, which is only about 10% of the population of the
Yeah.
country. So everybody else has to find some alternative. Many many of the people in the earlier days sent their children to private schools because the corporations paid for it, but the economic times are not dictating that that's going to happen in the same way. So parents there would say to us, we have no choice, we must home educate, we're being forced to home educate. And we were able to say to them largely, well, you actually have the best choice. It's actually
Mm.
a very good choice, and it'll work very well. So some of it is just working through the semantics, the terminology, and being able to work our way through it. I think one of the challenges we have is some of those words. In the United States and Canada, it's largely called homeschooling, which I don't really like because education actually has very little to do with school. I like home education, but I like what they call it in some of the Slavic countries even better, where they call it family education, where it's
Mm.
based around a family and the things that happen there.
And you've obviously seen different countries, how they deal with the legislation surrounding home education. In an ideal country, drawing together all of these things, what would you say is the perfect balance of making sure that children aren't going off the radar, but they're getting a good education, but families have oversight and control of the education? What would that look like? Would it look like having a register? Would it look like not having a register? What would it be?
There's a lot of danger in the details, but I think that for parents to opt out of the state school system, which in most places in the world, there's some form of compulsory education. Children must be in school. And for it to be able to opt out, you need to tell someone that you're going to opt out. That may be simply a letter saying, "Excuse me, government, I'm opting out." Some form of that declaration. I think to ask permission is not acceptable, but to provide some notification is reasonable. Then it becomes a matter of what control is exerted. I think that parents to be able to simply say, we're providing an education. In our province, the law simply requires that we provide an education that's equivalent. It's not defined anywhere, but it would be the job of the government, basically, if they have a concern, to prove that we are not providing an education that's equivalent.
Hmm.
And it's only in that case that they should have any role. So it's really, let us do what we're doing, and if you have a problem, then prove that you have a problem.
Hmm.
And that becomes really, I think, much more of the mode of operation that I think is much more of an ideal system, versus parents going cap in hand to government saying, please, can I have permission, and proving that what they're doing is reasonable. And there's a lot of places that try to do that, but it's never successful. Uh,
Hmm.
those those regulatory systems don't actually result in any better outcomes.
Hmm. And the Global Home Education Exchange, the conference this year was held in the United Kingdom. What's your perception of how, the state of home education in the UK?
The UK has had traditionally a very open and accepting system of allowing parents to do this with relatively little oversight and control, which I think is a model for around the world. A lot of places are very, very jealous and very
Hmm.
appreciative of what the UK has. I think the danger is to take it for granted. I think
Hmm.
we always need to be watchful. We always need to be respectful. We always need to be educating our education officials and legislators in what the issues are, and so often saying, well, you could do that, but it really isn't going to get you where you want to be, and helping them in the interests that they have. There's a lot of information around in the world that's been developed that would help places in the world to be able to analyze and to plan for legislation and regulatory changes.
And lastly, I just wanted to ask, you mentioned a point about the people you've worked with right at the start of the podcast, and then you've mentioned the UAE and other countries. I think sometimes there's a stereotype about who homeschools. And I think maybe that's come from the fact that in the States, it's a more established movement, and traditionally maybe it was a conservative Christian movement. I mean, I know the answer, but I want you to reflect on your experience globally of, is that the case? Is it just conservative Christians who are doing this thing?
No, it is not. We have colleagues, friends, partners that are involved in the movement that are Muslims, are atheists, are various streams of political thought. And we basically agree that parents should be responsible. And so it's a movement that's diverse. It's a movement that's becoming more and more diverse, both ethnically, um, faith-wise, on a number of different aspects. People from around the world, whether that be the Middle East, whether that be the Orient, whether that be Japan or South America, Eastern Europe. It's all over the world and very diverse in terms of the motivations and the methodology.
Gerald, I could go on for hours. Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for the visit. It's been nothing but a privilege.
And thank you at home so much for joining the Seatton Education Podcast. Whether you watched on YouTube or you listened as a podcast, please like, comment and follow as we discuss how home education can be an achievable alternative to conventional schooling.